Let's begin.
Wait. I sold my soul to who? Oh, hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. I was just reading through my first book, and I realized maybe I shouldn't be. Too often we fork over what we need for what we desire. But if you desire good terror, I've got what you need. Lock those doors and settle yourselves in by your monitor screens for a tale of terror that Ethan Blades and Charlie Blackmoore like to call Ashes of Anguish.
It started with a dream. I'd always loved art, ever since I was a toddler. I'd always dreamed of being a famous and beloved artist with a nice and happy family. Everything we could ever need or want. And nice, friendly neighbors who we'd hang out with and be good friends with. Unfortunately, it's not really how the world works. So, what happened instead is I became your average office worker. I had a marriage with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Our house was decent, but nothing special, and we made ends meet, but didn't have a lot to spend on luxuries. Overall, I had a decent life. Nothing special, but it was good. I, however, was too depressed to see it that way. I was miserable all the time, and every second I spent alive. My life was a repeat of wake up, go to work, do about 3 hours of overtime because most of the employees were incompetent idiots and I needed to fix their fuck-ups and do extra work so that we were on schedule, come home, grab a beer, and pretend everything's fine while eating dinner, and then going to bed. I had hobbies and other things that I liked to do on rare occasion when I wasn't working, and on weekends, but the day-to-day consumed most of my energy and time. At least until Christmas 10 years ago. One of the previous hobbies I mentioned was horror. I loved horror. I loved horror movies, horror stories. I collected horror memorabilia, and I made my own horror stuff. It was one of the few things I still constantly enjoyed doing. Anyway, my birthday was coming up, and I decided to take my vacation time that I hadn't used to get the day off. My wife was really excited and wanted to throw me a birthday party, despite knowing I don't really like celebrating my birthday. I changed my mind, however, when she said it would just be immediate family and friends, and saying it would be horror-themed. So, I agreed to it, knowing how happy it would make her feel, and actually looking forward to it for once. She also wanted me out of the house the week before, so that she could prepare the house, and I agreed. So, I went to the local motel, until it was come home arrived. Right when I arrived, I was astounded at what I saw. It looked just like it was Halloween. The yard was turned into a graveyard. There were decorations that looked like dead people hanging from the trees, decomposing heads put on spikes, and bones arranged in weird, disturbing shapes. When I got inside, I was even more amazed. It looked just like an old haunted house. There were cobwebs and dust all over, and the walls were made to look like they were peeling. I loved it. Eventually, I got to the living room, where everyone was waiting. They all wished me a happy birthday, and we all started talking and joking, all that stuff. It was great, and I was having a really good time. Eventually, it was dinner time. We had my favorite, homemade sausage gravy over fresh homemade biscuits and pie. After dinner, it was time for cupcakes, which my wife had made to look like brains, complete with red cream filling that looked like blood. Finally, after everyone had a couple of cupcakes, the rest were leftovers/snacks for me and my family, it was time for gifts. True to the horror theme, all the gifts were horror-based, and also somewhat based on their tastes. First, my daughter gave me her present. It was a creepy doll. It was porcelain with white skin, tattered clothes, glowing eyes with blood pouring from them, and a wide grin that stretched across its face. It was awesome, and it went on my shelf in my bedroom. Next, my son gave me his gift. It was 2 video games, Layers of Fear and The Evil Within. They went into the living room with the other games we had. My friend James gave me a handcrafted wooden figurine of my favorite video game character, Jack of Blades. The gift itself wasn't exactly in the horror theme, but I was still grateful to have it. It was awesome. Next, my friend Charlie gave me hers. It was a shit ton of horror shirts, and they were all awesome. And finally, it was my wife's turn. She got me a book, written by a narrator she apparently listened to a lot. The book was called From Anguish to Ashes, This Soul is Yours to Take. It was written by someone calling themselves L.W. Sutton. I was excited, as I hadn't gotten a new horror book for a while, and this one looked promising. I put it away and continued enjoying the day. The next day, though, I had to go back to work, and so I went, doing my work and everyone else's, as usual, fueling my negativity more and more. Eventually, I stopped giving a fuck and decided if they weren't going to work, neither was I. I brought the book to work, since I hadn't gotten a chance to read it because of my normal day-to-day schedule, and I read during my work hours. The stories were great, really, but one in particular story struck me. It was probably where the book got its name. It was called From Anguish to Ashes. It talks about the Dubyuk, malevolent entities without a physical form that can give its host incredible powers at a terrible cost. That's not the part that intrigued me, however. What made my wheels in my head start turning was the first part, about a particularly powerful one that takes the form of a quill and ink. It's said that those who use it can change reality itself, or achieve anything they want, until the Dubyuk decides to leave them, usually broken and without worth. Even after I was done with the story, weeks after even, I kept thinking about that story. An ink and quill with the power to make exactly what you want by writing or drawing with it. It sounded crazy, but what if it wasn't? I eventually decided to look into it and see if there was anything I could find out about it. I messaged James about it, since he knows all kinds of shit about demons, the paranormal, and the supernatural. He knew all about Dubyuk. He said that the most common Dubyuk are nothing like what the book describes, but that there is a specific type that's able to do that. These are far more ancient and powerful, but are also incredibly rare, almost impossible to find. He asked why I wanted to find this particular one so much. I couldn't tell him the real reason, so I made up a lie. I told him that it was just something that I was researching to complete a project that I was working on. Despite the lie, he told me more about the subject, leaving me to try and figure out the rest of the shit on my own. He helped as much as possible, to which I was grateful for, but the whole Dubuque thing made me feel uneasy. I knew deep down that it was probably a bunch of bullshit. I just couldn't let it go. I never got over the fact that perhaps something like that truly existed. The idea of being able to change reality with a simple invention, such as a quill and ink, was fascinating. If it were real, then maybe I'd be able to change the aspects of my life that meant nothing to me, the aspects that were making me miserable. Of course, I would keep my family and friends. I just had to know. James didn't seem to be fazed or clued into the fact that I wasn't being honest with him. He bid a good evening, and I went about the research of finding the possible existence of that ink and quill. I searched high and low for weeks, browsed the internet for any possible clue as to where the item that I desired may be. Alas, I came up empty-handed. There was no hint of the item anywhere on the internet, no hint of anything with that ability even existing. I called off my search for the night, but a thought occurred to me as I crawled into bed with my wife. I could ask one person for help. I awoke the next morning to the smell of bacon. My hand felt around the bed. I glanced at the empty space beside me to realize that my wife was already awake and cooking breakfast. I sat upright in bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed a number. The line rang several times before a woman's voice answered. I gave a brief explanation to Charlie about the conversation that I had with James. I told her the same thing that I told him. She wasn't buying it. Charlie said that I would have to do a favor for her if I wanted her help. I agreed to the circumstance because it was necessary that I find this item. Now, Charlie didn't exactly tell me what the favor was, nor did she make it easy about how in the world I would be able to find them. However, she did tell me that it would be in a place with a lot of trees. The cryptic shit couldn't make finding the damn thing any easier on me. I thanked her, told her that I would do the favor when she needed, and hung up the phone. The following few days were a fucking disaster. I didn't focus on my job. All I could think about was that goddamn ink and quill. I did as much research on the thing as I possibly could, even after hearing Charlie's cryptic shit. Yet, I still came up empty-handed. It wasn't until I was driving home when the sudden realization hit me. The only place that I lived the closest to a bunch of trees was Freetown Fall River State Forest. The chances of it actually being in the state forest were slim to none. Still, it was worth a shot. I pulled into the parking space, got out of the car, locked the doors, and started my way down the dirt path. The ominous feeling in the air should have been enough to make me turn around, but my determination to find the desired item overpowered my fear. I searched high and low for hours in the state park, digging up the dirt in several places on the park floor. I searched every nook and cranny, underneath rocks, underneath overgrown tree brush, and still nothing. Night had fallen upon the park faster than I had expected. And then again, I wasn't paying attention to that. I began to start up the dirt path once more, when a different thought struck me. What if there was one place that I haven't searched? What if the item I've been looking for was in plain sight this entire time? I followed that dirt path until I reached the sign announcing the rules and regulations of the park. I knelt down onto the soft soil and furiously dug into the ground. The further I dug into the soil, the more I felt my hope fading. That was until my fingers hit something solid. I scooped the surrounding dirt from around the wooden box, carefully pulled the ancient-looking box out of the ground. My hands shook as I lifted that wooden lid, my eyes widen upon what lay inside. Inside the box was the ink and quill that I had spent weeks searching for. Charlie hadn't been kidding when she told me that it would be surrounded by trees. God damn, her cryptic shit finally paid off, and I was grateful to her. I closed the lid and hurried to my car, carefully setting the dirty box in the passenger seat before speeding out of the parking lot. I pulled into the driveway of my house about 20 minutes later, excitement still spreading throughout me. My wife greeted me when I entered the house, a happy smile on her face as well as the kids' faces. However, I simply said, "I'm home," and hurried up the staircase to my office. I quickly sat down in the chair, placed the box atop the desk, and opened the lid once more. I still couldn't believe what I was seeing. The item that I had searched for was finally in my possession. Now it was time to test it out. I grabbed a piece of blank paper from out the tray to my left. I hesitantly and cautiously took out the little vial of ink, placed it on the desk, and unscrewed the lid. I carefully picked up the quill, dipped the metal tip of it into the ink, and started to write. Hours ticked by. I sat there just staring at the piece of paper that I had written upon, waiting for something to happen, yet nothing did. That was it. I spent weeks looking for this damn thing, and it didn't do anything? The lid to the vial was replaced, the metal tip of the quill wiped off, and both items were placed back into the box from whence they came. I disappointedly shook my head when I stood up from the chair, pissed off that the item did nothing. I shut the light off on my way out of the study, not bothering to look back at the thing I now had in my possession. I crawled into bed with my wife that night, apologizing for being a bit moody when I had gotten home. She brushed the comment off, said she wasn't feeling well, and fell asleep. I awoke the next morning to the smell of something familiar, yet I couldn't quite figure out what the scent was. I slowly sat upright in bed, glancing over at the empty spot beside me as I do every morning. I took a quick shower, got dressed in a fresh pair of clothes, and headed down the staircase and into the kitchen. The kids were sitting at the kitchen table, mindlessly coloring while my wife sluggishly moved around the room. I said good morning to my family, as I did every single morning, only my wife acknowledged me. She forced a smile on her face and greeted me while my children stayed silent. My children didn't say anything. They didn't even look up at me, which was weird and slightly concerning. I waved a hand in front of their faces. Not even the batting of an eyelash occurred. My wife shook her head, as she had already tried to get their attention. I decided it was best to let them be. I walked over to the counter and grabbed a cup of coffee, when a loud clash sounded in the room. I looked over to see my wife's limp body laying on the floor. I rushed over to her, calling her name, and shook her body. She didn't move. I yelled at my kids to call for an ambulance, but they just sat at the table, staring at the bowls in front of them. I dug around in the pockets of my sweatpants for my cell phone, but it wasn't there. Odd. I could have sworn that I had placed it there. I jumped up from the floor, grabbed her cell phone from the island's countertop, and dialed 911. I sat on the cool, tiled floor, holding my wife, my left hand stroking her beautiful face, but her eyes, they were already glossing over from the life that had already faded. The ambulance came. Paramedics pulled my wife from my arms and placed her on the gurney. They hastily rushed my wife out the front door while I grabbed my children, buckled them in the car, and sped off toward the hospital. Hours ticked by in the waiting room. I sat in the chair nervously shaking my leg while my children fucking stared off into space. They were not fazed by anything happening around them. I couldn't help but stare at my kids, absolutely astounded at how strange they were being. They should be scared, should be wrapped up in my arms, crying and asking if their mom was going to be okay, yet that wasn't the case. They simply didn't care. I didn't know what to think about the fucked up situation I was currently in. It was like my kids weren't actually my kids. It was more or less as if someone or something had sucked the life from them, and it was scaring the living shit out of me. The more I pondered the thought of them, the more I began to wonder. However, I was brought back to reality when the doctor called my name. I jumped up from the chair I had been anxiously waiting in. The doctor calmly approached me, a file chart in hand. He glanced at the chart for a moment to confirm my wife's name before delivering the bad news. My wife had collapsed in the kitchen due to a brain aneurysm. She was still breathing in the ambulance, and they did everything that they could, but she passed away shortly after being in the emergency room. It took them hours to figure out the cause of death, but they did, and I wish they hadn't. The doctor placed his hand on my shoulder, right as my knees hit the hard, cold, tiled floor of the waiting room. Tears welled to the brim of my eyes. I blinked a few times, just hoping to be told that this was all some kind of practical joke. And it wasn't. The salty liquid rolled down my cheeks, the back of my hand, rubbing them away before anyone else could notice. I had to keep myself together for the kids, even if they didn't seem to give a shit. I grabbed the hands of my children and hastily walked out of that godforsaken building. The mid-afternoon sunlight shone upon our faces as we stepped onto the cracked cement sidewalk. I said a few words to my children, and again, the little shits said nothing. I mindlessly stared at the road ahead of me, the gas tank slowly dwindling to nothing, which was the only reason why I had returned home. I pulled into the driveway to see my friend, James, leaning against the white-colored pillar of the front porch. He gave me a friendly wave, and I stepped out of my car. My kids didn't move. They just continued to stare downward. Fuck! They didn't even flinch when I grabbed their hands and pulled their asses out of the car. James asked me what the fuck was going on because he got a call from the hospital. I guess my wife had listed him as an emergency contact in case something were to ever happen to her, which made absolutely no sense. But I guess it was for extra measures in case I wasn't able to be there. He followed me into the house, nudging my kids through the threshold of the front door. James was able to get the kids onto the couch before storming into the kitchen and bombarding me with questions about what the fuck was going on and where my wife was. I explained the entire situation, about the reason why I had asked him about the Dubuque, and he went ballistic. James yelled at me about the dangers of messing with shit like that, and I don't know what the fuck really happened, but I lost my cool. I grabbed a knife from the wooden block on the counter and plunged it directly into his throat. I watched the blood gush from around the metal blade and out of the wound. It gave me an idea. Maybe, just maybe, I could right this wrong by using his blood to write with the quill and get my wife back. It wasn't a thought that I particularly liked, but it was the only solution that I could think of at the moment. I stomped up the staircase with a small bowl of blood, pulled out the quill from its box, and quickly scribbled down what I thought to be the desire of wanting my wife back. Yet when I glanced down at the paper, the words were different. My cell phone began to ring while I stood there, blankly staring at the words that I had written. I don't even remember picking up the phone, sitting atop the desk, but I remember hearing a woman's voice. She informed me that I had 1 week to get my things packed and move out of the house, as it was now foreclosed. The bank was repossessing it due to lack of payments. No, this couldn't be happening. I'd been keeping up on my mortgage payments. I mean, I got paid a decent amount of money for crying out loud. Using James's blood to write out what I wanted seemed to have the opposite effect of what I'd been hoping for. Things went black after that, and when I came to, Charlie was squatting over me, concerned expression plastered on her pale face. She asked me what in the hell was going on because she'd found my kids sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, and James's body laying on the kitchen floor, blood pooled around his black hair. I stumbled upon my words, but I think she understood what I was saying because she sat me down in the chair behind the desk and told me that these things were happening for a reason. But I didn't want to hear her cryptic bullshit. I grabbed the quill from atop the wooden desk, raised my arm, and jabbed the thin, metal sharp tip into her left eye. Her blood glided across the paper, much easier and a lot smoother than James's blood had. And once more, what I thought I was writing wasn't at all the words that were written on that goddamn sheet of paper. The words staring up at me from that white piece of paper were what I had wanted all of my life. To be a great, famous artist. My wife was gone. My 2 best friends were dead, and my kids, I don't know what they were anymore, because they just seemed soulless, like a mere imitation of my actual kids, which led me to question, where the fuck are my kids really at? Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing about that entire ordeal made a lick of sense. I tried to explain what happened when the police arrived at my house to find those things that mimicked my kids and the bodies of my friends. Apparently, the neighbors had heard a woman screaming, that woman being Charlie. The police officers didn't believe the story that I spewed out of my mouth. They put handcuffs on me, placed me in the back of the police cruiser, while I had to watch a social worker comfort the lifeless things they referred to as my children. I spent about 2 weeks in a horribly cold jail cell, not saying anything to the others that were locked inside with me. The only words I muttered were quill and ink, quill and ink, quill and ink, as if I were in a trance. A trial quickly ensued after that. I was deemed not mentally competent to withstand trial, and was sentenced to live the remainder of my life locked away in this padded cell of the psychiatric ward for criminals. My life had been perfect the way it was, now that I think about it. I was happily married with 2 wonderful children and friends who deeply cared about me, friends that I considered family. I may have had a job that I didn't like, and may have had the dream to become a famous artist, but things were perfect as is. I would still have all of that if I hadn't been intrigued by that goddamned book. I would be at home with the people I cared about the most if it hadn't been for that goddamn quill and ink.
So, I guess before you go looking for something, you should make sure it's not looking for you first. For the deeds of evil are always wrapped in coincidence. But if you want more of the red stuff that you crave so desperately, but don't want to suffer eternal damnation for it, come back again next weekend. And until then, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.